I'd like to welcome all of you to the final presentation of the Fall 2019 session of the Medical History Interest Group. I'm Lane Carpenter, and I'm the archivist here at Lapis Library. The Medical History Interest Group presentations are sponsored by Lapis Library History Collections and the Department of Bioethics and Interdisciplinary Studies. If you haven't already done so, please sign the attendance sheet before you leave today. Refreshments are also available on the other side of the wall, so please help yourself. We are currently working on the Spring 2020 schedule. Among our topics will be the 1979 anthrax outbreak in the Soviet Union, deceased local herbalist Emma Dupree, and the effect of the scientific management movement on American medicine in the early 20th century. We also invite you to take a look at our exhibits at the library, many of which are commemorating anniversaries. Here on the fourth floor, we have a pop-up exhibit that is related to today's lecture. The display features books from Joyner Library's special collections and Lapis Library's history collections. We also have scientists and their microscopes, which shows various microscopes in our collection with images of well-known scientists who use the same versions in their research, and that's just over there. In the gallery space, we are commemorating 50 years since our library was founded with the exhibit Lapis Library celebrating 50 years of history and service. We also have two exhibits on the second floor, celebrating 100 years of public health nursing in North Carolina, which features artifacts from the Country Doctor Museum and archival materials from our library's history collections. And finally, to commemorate 300 years since the pirate Blackbeard's adventures around North Carolina, we have the Plague of Piracy, which includes photographs and artifact cast replicas on loan from the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology and the Queen Anne's Revenge Lab, and it's complemented with artifacts from the Country Doctor Museum. Today's presentation is Cacao and Chinchona, Medical Marvels and Curiosities from the Iberian New World. Our presenter is Angela Thompson, PhD, History, retired. Angela Thompson recently retired from ECU's Department of History, where she was a professor of Latin American and Atlantic world history for 30 years. She has researched, written, and taught about the history of medicine, disease, food, and public health in the Atlantic world, among other topics. So please welcome Angela Thompson with Cacao and Chinchona, Medical Marvels and Curiosities from the Iberian New World.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. And I want to say a special thank you to my students who've shown up, and I'm so glad to see you all. I also want to thank the staff at Lapis and Joyner, in particular Lane Carpenter, Melissa Nasea, and Ralph Scott, for their efforts in acquiring the works, the rare books that I will feature in my talk today, some of which, in fact most of which, you can see exhibited on the table in the pop-up exhibit. And I do urge you to look at those, and they're also available for you to go to either collection where they reside and use them there. They're just wonderful books. So. When Columbus encountered the lands of the New World, which was not new to him because he didn't know where he was, he hoped to find spices and gold. What he and others after him found instead were new plants and new animals unknown in the old world that would provide an unlimited cornucopia of foods and medicines far more valuable than gold or the spices of Asia. Cacao, and Chinchona are just three of these marvels from the New World, many of which had religious, medicinal, and food value for Native Americans and for others around the world and even today. Today, I will focus on the history of these and other marvelous and curious plants from the New World based on some of the manuscripts that we have in our library, which we've worked for years. I teach, or did teach, a graduate course on the history of food and medicine in the New World. And so we have spent time looking for and acquiring these texts for the library. Now, in the literature, in the historical literature of the New World and of the encounter between Old World and New, one might read a lot about the foods that came from the New World. In particular, the four most important ones were maize, sweet potato, potato, and manioc, which is also called cassava or yucca. Those are the four most important foods that sustained the New World. And some scholars attribute the rise in the world population to their dissemination around the entire world. They are important nowadays in many cuisines. Where do you go where you don't find a potato, for example, or something made of potatoes? Maize has been so important for not only peoples, but the animals that they raise. Sweet potato, native to the Circum-Caribbean area, is one of the most nutritionally dense foods in the world. Manioc, or cassava, also from the humid rainforests of the Caribbean, Circum-Caribbean, and Upper South America, is not as nutritionally dense, does not have the protein contents that some of the other foods do, but which, when it's also poisonous like potatoes, which when processed, ground up, processed, and dried into a flour can be kept for over 2 years in a tropical environment without deteriorating. Now they're great, but I'm not going to talk about them today. Also great are tomatoes, chilies, peanuts, 3 other foods that accompany the ones I've talked about before. What would we do without them? Peanuts, a legume, along with all the other beans and squashes from the New World, are wonderful. And then tobacco, which is a medicinal plant. I'm not going to talk about it much today. It's perhaps one of the most important medicinal plants in the Americas, used medicinally by Native Americans from all the way from Canada to South America, usually in the form of its smoke, because smoke was seen by many peoples as purifying. Gets rid of miasmas, as they talked about in the 19th century. But also for other things. I mean, it was a traditional remedy for bee stings and insect bites and things like that, as my mother used to use it when we got bee stings and insect bites. And then, of course, it is a recreational drug, a legal one. But of all the drugs I'll talk about today, it is far more dangerous in many ways than they are, with much less medicinal value. But many of the other medical marvels from the area that is today Latin America are not well known, have not been written about much in the historical literature, although ethnohistorians have mentioned them, and then anthropologists have written about them. But some of these medicines have been important either as medicines, foods, or as the basis for modern medicines that have real effect. And then some of them have also been misused, abused, and misunderstood. as Spain expanded its empire from the 15th to the 18th century. It usually sent out into its new lands priests, government officials. It encouraged native informants and other professionals to provide information about that empire. Physicians and crown officials studied new plants in particular for food, medicine, and other commercial uses like dyes for textiles. Philip II, in the middle of the 17th century, sent his royal physician, Francisco Hernandez, in the 1750s to the New World to set up a system of medical oversight called the Protomedicato, and to study native medical practices and medicines. For 5 years, he collected information from all over Spain's New World empire. And under Philip II, that empire included all of the Americas. He was the monarch of both Portugal and thus Portugal's Brazilian empire, as well as his African empire. He's probably an emperor or a king that has ruled over more land than anyone else in the history of the world. Now, Hernandez focused his efforts mostly on Mexico. I'm not sure he ever went to other parts, but he did use informants to supply information and medicinal plants from elsewhere in the Americas. His information and that of subsequent physicians and scholars who used his text resulted in the official pharmacopoeia of Spain, published by the Royal Protomedicato, or the Royal Medical Board. And this copy that I have a picture of here comes from the early 18th century. But even before Hernandez traveled to Mexico, the Varieties manuscript, also called the Barberini Codex, and in English, the Aztec Herbal of 1552, was written. This work was the first herbal and medical text composed in the New World, written in 1552 originally in Nahuatl, the lingua franca of the Aztec Empire. It was written by Martin de la Cruz. He was a student at the school of Tlatelolco. This was a school that Catholic priests had established for sons of the Aztec elite to facilitate conversion and assimilation of natives into the Spanish Empire. De la Cruz studied both native and European medicine and became a physician. He composed this manuscript in order to introduce to his teachers, because he honored them, and to the rulers of Spain, the very useful medicinal plants that his unnative peoples had used. Another classmate and teacher at the school, Juan Badiano, translated the work into Spanish, hence the name of the Latin manuscript, Varieties manuscript. This manuscript includes illustrations of over 100 plants with descriptions of their medical uses. And we've opened a few pages where you can see some of them, and I have a few examples here. Sadly, the Nahuatl version of the manuscript has been lost. Don't know if it survives. There's always these things that people find buried in archives somewhere, but so far no one's found this manuscript. But the Latin manuscript was gifted to the Spanish Empire and sent to its king, Charles I. And it was likely seen by his son and heir and successor, Philip II, who sent Hernandez to Mexico. But what happened to it after that is not clear. By the early 17th century, it had become part of the library of the Cardinal Francesco Barberini, who was a nephew of Pope Urban VII. Then in 1902, that library was absorbed into the Vatican Library. Of course, this manuscript was here buried. Then in 1929, a man named Charles Clark came upon it while he was doing research in the Vatican Library. Soon thereafter, two people were interested in doing an English translation of that work, and they gained permission to do so. One was William Gates, and the other was Emily Walcott Imart. They published their editions in 1939 and 1940, respectively. The copy we have here at Lapis is a copy of the better of these two translations, or at least that's what scholars say. The one by Emily Imart. Better because her edition reproduced a full set of color facsimiles of the beautiful plates in the original Badianus manuscript. And her translations of the Latin descriptions are somewhat more complete. The original Latin manuscript, pictured here, called the Codex Barberini after Cardinal Barberini, was returned to Mexico by Pope John Paul II in 1990. It now resides in the magnificent Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico City, a great museum, archive, and library. And if you ever go to Mexico City, if you go nowhere else, go to that museum. It is wonderful. Also, I have here, after the Barberini text was returned to Mexico, the Mexican Archaeological magazine reproduced it, and there's two editions that write about it, and you can look at that afterwards, and I urge you to. It's a beautiful publication itself. Just a few examples to show how the Badianus manuscript worked. This is a illustration of a cactus, the Teonochtli, that was used for toothache. Nochtli refers to a family of cacti that produce fruits. And the Nochtli usually referred to the fruit of the cacti. This cacti, Teonochtli, means cacti of the gods, because Teo, just like almost in Latin and even in Nahuatl, referred to the gods. Teotihuacan, for example, in Mexico is City of Gods. The explanation, that if you can read the Latin at the bottom, but this is what it says. It says the root of the Teonochtli should be ground up, burned with deer horn, and it's very common to find remedies, not only native remedies, but the more Europeanized remedies as well, that mix plant and animal parts. Also, there are plants we see. One is called tail of a possum. And I used to thought, okay, I read these remedies and it said some plant and then a tail of a possum? Really? But what that was referring to was this plant that's called tail of a possum because it resembles an animal, that animal part. In addition, this was to be ground with special stones, the Beaux-Arts stones, cornmeal that has been mixed with salt, bound in a cloth, and put on the effective tooth or teeth. I'm not sure how effective it was, but even today one can go to traditional Mexican markets where you'll probably find a woman who specializes in selling medicinal plants, and she will show you how to use them, and I have done that. I have sought that. Also, the work I have featured here too by Ortiz de Montellano, it's also on the bibliography that's available to you as a handout on the exhibit table, who has done an assessment of Aztec medicine. And he believes that the Aztecs were actually very good observers, that they're physicians, which could be both men and women, were very good observers, and that some, perhaps not all, of their remedies were effective at some level. This more familiar cactus, which we call the nopal, in Nahuatl it's nopali, was used for food, for medicine, and also to cultivate the insect cochineal. In the Badianus work, the nopal is used against inflammation. And it says, the part of the body affected is to be rubbed or anointed with a liquor made from this or a related cactus. And it lists, there's a list of cacti in the description that are related and that would produce the same effect. The fruits of these cacti, which you can go to the store and it's called a tuna. In Nahuatl that would have been called nochtli, the fruit. Tuna is actually a word from the Arawak, from the Caribbean, from Hispaniola, today Haiti and Dominican Republic, that was sort of transferred, and anywhere that the Spanish encountered that fruit thereafter, they encountered it in the Caribbean, and so they used the word when they encountered it anywhere. So that's why we have that name, tuna. But for the Nahuatl peoples, it would have been a nochtli. And it's a very good fruit and a very good food, both for humans, but also for this insect, which is actually a worm, called a nochichtli, after the fruit, in Nahuatl and cochineal in Spanish. The worm, when dried and crushed, produces a bright red dye. When it is mixed with other substances, it produces a purple dye. And both colors are shown here in this shawl, which is made from natural cotton. It's from Oaxaca, Mexico, with natural dyes. And you can see the red and the purple in this shawl. Today, they still cultivate all of these in Mexico, and they still use the traditional dyes in the traditional ways rather than the more modern chemical dyes. And they even weave a lot of their traditional cotton, which was the major fiber used in the Aztec Empire. And textiles are very important because that was the major source of their tax or tribute, were textiles even in the Aztec Empire. So all of these things were very important even before the Spanish came. And I'm sorry, I forgot to bring my backstrap loom to show you how they weave those, but it's a really simple but beautiful device that women use to make textiles, and they still use them today in some places. Cultivating cochineal became a major commercial enterprise in the Spanish Empire and helped fuel Europe's industrialization of textiles. And like cacti upon which it fed, cochineal was used medicinally as part of a poultice on wounds and even for cleaning teeth. Not exactly sure how that happened, but Hernandez, and I have a work here in which some of Hernandez's work is translated, excerpts. I mean, he had manuscripts and manuscripts of descriptions and remedies. Not all of that has been published, but you can read about it. But that's what he said. They used it for cleaning teeth. I have never personally heard or seen anyone in Mexico use it for cleaning teeth. But as we move on to our next illustration, in the middle in this illustration is a cacao tree. And it shows pods of different colors, meaning they're at various stages of ripeness. You can see the sort of purpley red ones. They're the heavier ones. They're getting ready. They're getting heavy and they're getting ready to fall. And I'll show you, and you can see in these photographs of some modern cacao trees, and you can see in the top right, you can see the same thing with pods in various states of ripeness. The statue is an Aztec holding a cacao pod. Hernandez, in his work, described 4 varieties of cacao. He devoted a whole chapter, at least in one of his works, to that. And these varieties range from small to large, meaning they had smaller to large pods. The smaller variety, he said, was the most valued for making the prized beverage that was used for both food and medicine, the prized cacao water, which is how cacao was mostly used then. Before Europeans came to the New World, cacao pods were mostly collected from wild trees that grew in the rainforests of Middle America and Upper South America. Europeans introduced cultivation of cacao trees to Africa, where most cacao is produced today. And I have brought some cacao today in the form of candy, which would not have existed then. And it so happened that they came out of the bag, they were all purple, very easy to use. So enjoy. And maybe you'll get the benefit that they said cacao produced. But most of it is now cultivated, plantationed in Africa. It's still collected wild in Middle America. There are some plantations in Upper South America. But they try to use the old ways of allowing the pods to fall, to fermenting them on the ground, and after that they take the pods. They eat the fruit. There's a pulp. The beans grow within a pod, and they're surrounded by a pulp, which is like many of the fruits natural to the rainforest, where they'll have these really tough seeds and beans in the center, surrounded by this custard-like fruit, and then a skin around that. Each cacao pod contains 30 to 50 beans or seeds. Apparently, the pulp is very flavorful, but unlike the beads or seeds, which can be transported, they can't be transported very far. So it's mostly consumed where the pods are collected. The beans are fermented in the pulp, separated, sweated, then dried and roasted. The shelled beans are ground, mixed with flavorings such as vanilla. Vanilla is also a plant native to Mexico. It's used both as a condiment and also as a medicine. It's also mixed with other flours, with chiles, and I think maybe the first time I taught this course on food, medicine, and disease, the final exam was everyone had to take one of these major foods and develop a dish and fix that dish and bring it, and we all had a meal. And one of my students found this wonderful recipe of brownies that were flavored with chili and chocolate. It's wonderful. And I should have brought the recipe and reproduced it. I'll try to send it to Melissa and have her send it around to the list. It's wonderful. Also, it's mixed with maize flour and then mixed with the water. And it was produced as a drink mostly for the elite. Medicinally, the cacao drink is a stimulant related to the coffee tree. As you can see, the name is Theobroma Cacao. Coffee is also Theobroma, but of course it's in the old world. It's an old world tree that's mostly now grown. Isn't that ironic? Cacao, a New World tree mostly produced in Africa. And today, coffee, and I've had people fight me over this. No, coffee's from South America. No, it's not. It was imported from, it's native to Africa, somewhere around Kenya, was imported to the New World and grew very well especially in volcanic soil. So that is the irony here. But medicinally, it is a stimulant, and it was drunk to promote vigor, including sexual vigor, which is probably why it was mostly reserved for the emperor of the Aztecs and his nobles. It's also mixed with the gum from another tree to cure dysentery. Some mixtures are ground with maize and a few other plants and given to those who were seriously ill or emaciated to fortify them, much like we would give an IV today. One mixture of cacao with another plant produces a drink that's called in Nahuatl chocolate. Maybe that's where the Spanish got their word chocolate and our English word chocolate. At any rate, both in Spanish and English, in some way the word chocolate came from Nahuatl because cacahuatl, which with the atl on the end means water or liquid, cacao, cacao, from which we say cacao. So all of those words are related in some way or the other. In addition to food and medicine, the cacao bean was used as a currency in the Aztec Empire, in Mexico, in native areas after the Spanish conquest, and even into the 19th century. In my earlier work on public health and disease, and as I was looking through archival documents in Mexico from the early 19th century, especially during the time of the independence movement from 1810 to 1821, I found all these public health warnings about cacao. And this is what was happening. It was becoming a public health menace. People were using the bean, because there was a shortage of currency, people were once again using the bean as currency. But they were also counterfeiting it. What they would do, they would break the cascara, or the shell. They would take out the bean and use that to make probably a drink. And then they would put back in the shell light-colored clay. And there is a clay, especially in Oaxaca, that's brown, that matches the cacao bean perfectly. It's used to make their black pottery. And then they would put the cascara, the shell, back together, and then sell it, and then trade it on again. Well, then other people, unbeknownst, they would do the same thing, except when they would take out what they thought was the bean, it would be clay, and when they would mix it up, a little bit of clay. We know that people ate clay, use clay as a purgative and all that, but if you get too much of it, it will make you sick or kill you. That was another way. Slaves ate dirt to kill themselves. So we know that it was a public health menace because of counterfeit cacao. But if you want to know more about the history of chocolate, I could talk all day about it. You need to read Sophie Coe's book on the true history of chocolate. The second edition, which I have featured here, was co-edited by her husband, Michael. Sophie Coe died while she was revising her book. She's a food historian, has written extensively about foods of the Americas. But her husband and co-editor, Michael Coe, who is a very well-known archaeologist of Mesoamerica, Middle America, the native peoples of Middle America, is known mostly for his work in helping to decipher the Maya glyphs. Unfortunately, he too passed away just a few weeks ago. So I noticed that as I was working on this presentation. And I think that's very sad. The next several works I want to highlight are by William Ruschenberger. We have two of his works and a substantial collection of his papers in Joyner in special collections. Ruschenberger was a naval surgeon, in part responsible for modernizing medical training in the United States Navy, and probably too in general in the U.S. in the 19th century. During the 1820s and 1830s, he served 2 tours in South America and wrote an account of his years traveling with the Navy, primarily in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Peru, with side trips to other parts of South America. In his work, he discusses several of the medicinal plants of South America, especially Chinchona, sometimes said Cinchona, which is the source of quinine. He also discussed coca, the source of cocaine. Later, he published results of experiments with 2 other plants, matico and cundarango. I'll begin with these last 2. In his publication of 1872, which is published in this collection of naval essays, which we have in Joyner Rare Books, he published an essay, The Case of a Poor Sailor, whose genitals were ulcerated, no doubt because of philandering during his trips around the world. Ruschenberger was called in to treat him and treated him with a poultice made of matico. If you look at the second paragraph, coarsely powdered matico leaves moistened into a pasty consistence with water, lightly packed in the inguinal ulcer, was promptly followed by the arrest of the hemorrhage. While the poultice did stop the hemorrhaging caused by the ulceration, it did not stop the spread of the ulcers themselves. The patient unfortunately died. From reading the essay, however, I think that the poor sailor was already too far gone when he entered the hospital for treatment. Nevertheless, matico was considered a useful remedy and became part of the U.S. pharmacopoeia, and its introduction was specifically attributed to Ruschenberger. The matico is a plant related to the pepper family that is native to Upper South America, and there it was used to deal with skin ailments. Ruschenberger also published the results of the use of another American plant, South American plant, the cundarango. We do not have a copy of this work. I have seen it before, but several years ago. But some of his notes about it are here in his papers. Apparently, the consul in Ecuador had heard that the Sandian plant cured tumors. The assertion was actually based on a story that a woman gave a concoction made from cundarango to her husband who was suffering from a tumor, but apparently who she was loath to take care for. So she gave him this concoction, which in the native language meant that it was something akin to dogbane or wolfbane, something used to kill pesky animals by poisoning them. So perhaps she was trying to poison him and do away with him. But instead, to hers and everybody else's surprise, he recovered and his tumor disappeared. Now this was a legend. Apparently news about this story reached the United States, and Ruschenberger was commissioned to actually gather samples of the plant and test it to see if it did have any anti-cancer effects. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, by this time he was already retired from the Navy, but still practicing medicine and still involved. He was like vice president for the American Philosophical Society, involved in the organization of the American Medical Association, and all of these institutions. So he was well known in the medical community. So he had samples collected from various valleys in the Andes and sent from Ecuador. He and a team of hospital physicians in Philadelphia, where he was from, used different parts of the plants and trying various concoctions, tested them on hospital patients suffering from cancer. They had no success in curing cancer with this plant, and they determined that it was not effective. And that's probably something else cured this fellow's tumor, or it just simply disappeared of its own. Drug testing, of course, was not regularized at this point. We would probably not follow this process of testing a remedy. But this is how many of the remedies, and I've read probably about this time, several thousands of them from Latin America, probably physicians experimented with their patients. That's what they had. Earlier, however, Ruschenberger's accounts of his tours in the 1820s and 1830s were published in this work, 3 Years in the Pacific. It's actually based, it's as if he published it based on one tour, but it's actually, because I've compared both the published account and his notes, and it's actually based on 2 tours, one in the 20s and one in the 1830s. But at any rate, in this account, he discusses his observations of medical practice and institutions, especially in Chile and Peru, and mentions Chinchona, but seems to be much more fascinated by coca. But I'll start with he mentions Chinchona, and in this work he says Peruvian bark, and also indigo. We've got some examples of both Chinchona, which is quina in Quechua, which is the native Andean language, and we have some examples of indigo as well as cochineal on the exhibit table that you can look at. Peruvian bark was actually the common name for this plant. But even before he visited South America, he was very likely familiar with this most useful tree because it had long been used to treat fevers, especially malaria, and was common in many formal pharmacopoeias. If you look in the Spanish pharmacopoeia that I showed you earlier, remedy after remedy lists Peruvian bark or Chinchona as an ingredient. And it, of course, was also used alone as an infusion. Although the U.S. did not have such a formal list of pharmaceuticals until around 1820, many European countries had such a list since the 17th and 18th centuries. And we see Peruvian bark in many of those. Also in the 18th century, Linnaeus named it with a misspelling. So I have to explain why. You will see sin, C-I, I'll bring up the tree. You'll see it spelled Cinchon or Cinchona in most of the remedies. In Spanish, it's Chinchona, or referred to as the quina tree. The quina is actually the Quechua word. Now I'll tell you the story of the Chinchona word, which has nothing to do with the quina word. The story is that in the 17th century, the Countess of Chinchon, who was the wife of a Peruvian viceroy, fell ill with tertian fever, usually a reference to malaria, and was treated with an infusion of the bark of the quina tree, and thus she was cured. And so she promoted its use as a cure for this and other fevers. But there's no written evidence for people who've gone back to try and track down this story that she actually fell ill during her time in Peru. But the viceroy actually fell ill with tertian fever. There is written evidence for that. So probably she used it to cure him. And at any rate, supposedly Linnaeus, when categorizing and giving plants scientific names, named the quina tree or the quina bark in her memory or because by that time I think she probably was no longer alive, but explicitly in her name. But he misspelled it as Chinchon rather than Chinchon. And later scholars have actually pointed out this misspelling. In Spanish it is Chinchona, also in memory of her. But she didn't actually introduce its use. Others had already spread its use, especially for treating malaria. Ironically, a disease introduced from the Old World. The Kynar Chinchona tree was truly a marvel. We see it used everywhere. Traditionally, before malaria ever appeared in the Americas, in the Andes, for a long time, the people of the Andes had used the bark of the quina tree or the Chinchona tree to cure fevers. The Spanish recognized its worth and tried to protect it from being exported or cultivated elsewhere in order to monopolize the trade in Peruvian bark. The Dutch, however, of course they had been ruled by the Spanish for a good while, but they managed to acquire some seeds. They cultivated it successfully in Asia, especially in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and they make a really good tonic water in Sri Lanka from those trees. And I've also brought, it's also called, of course, fever tree because of its use treating fevers. I brought an example of a very good tonic water. It's also very expensive. Ruschenberger seems to be more fascinated by the other Andean miracle plant, coca, from the Aymara word kuka. Aymara was the second most important language of the Inca Empire and the second most important language in the Andean region, mostly from Bolivia and Central Andes down south to Chile. Perhaps because until the 19th century, coca was little used outside its native region of South America. I'm looking, yes. In Peru, it was used as the plant that sustained life. It was viewed as divine. The chewing of the leaves was a stimulant like we would drink coffee. Hernandez discussed it in his 16th century work, so we know people knew about it before the 17th century. So why didn't it reach a commercial level outside the region of South America? For one, the coca bush is quite fragile. If you look at the very thin leaves, and I'll show you some pictures in a bit, and it grows in a very limited area of the rainforest on the eastern side of the Andes. Spain had many reasons to keep it localized. First of all, the demand for it in the Andes was very high. So all they could cultivate even was used in the Andes. It was essential to labor force, especially in silver mining. Providing mine workers with coca to chew allowed them to work longer and harder with less food. It allowed them to function better in high altitudes. And outside the mining regions of the Andes, perhaps more important, the church limited, stifled, or prevented cultivation and use of coca because its importance to traditional native religion, which they were trying to extirpate, and religious practice. Priests viewed it as pagan and thus dangerous to the process of conversion. Only as the Spanish Empire disintegrated did coca expand beyond South America. So economic use always trumped religious use. So in certain places in South America, the priests were unable to stifle and prevent coca because the miners and the ranchers wanted their workers to have access to it. Miners also refused, and Ruschenberger tells us this, that they refused to enter the mine without chewing coca because it would enrage the mama coca god. So Even though they are still Christian, they're not going to enter the mind without chewing coca. Ruschenberger says the virtues of coca are the most astonishing character. The Indians who are addicted to its use are enabled to withstand the toil of the mines amidst noxious metallic exhalations without rest, food, or protection from the climate. They run hundreds of leagues over deserts, arid plains, and craggy mountains, sustained only by the coca and a little parched corn, often too acting as mules and bearing loads through passes where animals cannot go. Many have attributed this frightful frugality and power of endurance to the effects of habit and not to the use of coca. But it must be remembered that the Indian is naturally voracious. It's known that many Spaniards were unable to perform the Herculean tasks of the Peruvians until they started using coca. Ruschenberger talked about how divine it was, but no one talks about the divine plant more than Golden Mortimer. In his book, published in 1901, he devotes this entire book, and you can go see it and see how thick it is, to the history of coca. His subtitle, The Divine Plant of the Inca, tells us his attitude toward this plant. He was effusive in his praise of it and in his evaluation of the Inca, the people he associated with its use. We learn from Mortimer and from other sources, such as Garcilaso de la Vega el Inca, who was half Inca, son of an Inca princess and a Spanish conqueror, who wrote the history of the Inca Empire. I have a copy of his book here, that coca was one of the 4 main crops of the Andean peoples, perhaps for millennia, along with potato, maize, and quinoa, which is not Chinchona and not quinoa. It's quinoa. It's a grain. In this engraving, Mama Coca presents the gift of the plant to the conquerors of the Andes. Under the Inca, it was the plant that helped to sustain life in the Andes, thus its divine status. For the Spanish, it was better than gold, spices, or silver. It facilitated the extraction of all of those metals and more: silver, gold, tin, copper, mercury, and numerous other commercial activities in Spain's empire. Until the 19th century, it was used traditionally. The leaves were chewed, sometimes with lime, stuck in the cheek, like snuff, and with parched corn. It provided Andean people their major source of food and stimulant when working or traveling. Like cacao, coca leaves were used as currency. It was also used as a sacrifice to the gods, a gift to the gods. As coca spread in the 19th century, it became another stimulant along with coffee, tea, and cacao, although cacao now in the 19th century has been turned into a candy. In Paris or France in general, coca was mixed with wine to produce a wine tonic. It formed the basis of numerous tonics and beverages elsewhere, such as Coca-Cola, using both the Andean coca and the African cola nut to produce this much consumed soft drink. It was a tonic to cure motion sickness. In 1901, when Mortimer published this book, it was still a miracle plant. Here's a picture, an illustration. His book is full of illustrations of all parts of the plant, and it's very, very detailed. It's a wonderful book to read. It's a lot of fun. An example of an actual coca bush. And as you can see, the leaves are almost translucent. They're quite fragile. So we come to Coca-Cola and to the Vin Mariani. 2 19th century beverages that have a history together, both based on coca. First one, we have the Coca-Cola book. If you look at this, a long time it took me to figure out, why is this cover like this? And then I realized, oh, it's the can. It's meant to be the can, so it's got this strange look. And well, we have this book in Joiner, and we have the book by Angelo Mariani on his concoction called the Vin Mariani. We also have that book. And I don't have a picture of it. And my picture didn't come out too well. In the 1980s, Dr. John Pemberton concocted Coca-Cola using coca. Now, ironically, in the United States, coca was seen as one way to deal with alcohol and morphine addiction. Dr. Pemberton was addicted to morphine. Like many other veterans of the Civil War, they were addicted to morphine because of their battle injuries. Earlier, Angelo Mariani, who was from Corsica, combined an infusion of coca with French Bordeaux wine. It produced a wine tonic. It became very, very popular in Europe. He based his company in Paris. And then his brother or brother-in-law, not quite sure which, and I realized it was that person, his brother or brother-in-law, Horace, was the actual publisher of his book called Coca and Its Therapeutic Application that we have here in Lapis, published in 1892. Well, they brought it over to the United States, and Dr. Pemberton took it up and decided to improve it by adding extraction from the cola nut along with the wine and the coca, and then some other things to make it taste. And this was an improvement. He called it the French wine, the wine French coca, or French wine coca, one or the other. And in other words, to give Mariani a little bit of credit. Unfortunately, in Atlanta, he ran up against the temperance movement and ministers who were against the alcohol in it. You know, they didn't know anything about the effects of coca or the cola nut, which were also stimulants. So he developed a formula that took out the wine and based it mostly on the coca, or what by then was essentially cocaine, and extraction of the cola nut. And so we have Coca-Cola, which was perhaps even more potent than the wine. So, unfortunately, this effort to extract active ingredients, turning coca into cocaine, turned it eventually into a dangerous, misused illegal drug in the 20th and 21st century that has almost destroyed several countries. Colombia several decades ago, it's trying to recover. Mexico today, and we saw that just very recently with the massacre of the Mormon women and children in northern Mexico. The drug cartels have wreaked havoc on those societies, and all because of demand not in their own societies, but in the US and Europe. Drug traders can lose 75% of the product that they sell and still make tremendous profits. No other enterprise comes close. But in South America today, rejecting decades of U.S. interference in which they've tried to destroy the coca crops, which has been mostly futile. There's been a return to native cultivation and uses of coca. That's been reasserted with the election of Evo Morales as president of Bolivia, who just resigned yesterday. So the story keeps going on. He was a cocalera, a grower of coca. And most of his export came from native peoples who also grew coca. In Peru, a research institute has directed a lot of its resources to research viable uses of coca. And anywhere in the Andes, one can find coca in markets as leaves or dried leaves for tea. And I've used it there because it allows you to function in the high Andes while you get used to that altitude. So you don't suffer altitude sickness, which is awful if you do, and causes nausea and all kinds of problems. It's taking its place again as the preferred stimulant over the foreign imported coffee. Thank you, and now I will take questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Thompson. I'd like to remind everyone that if you haven't signed the sheet, please do so before you leave. But we'll take questions now. I'm going to bring the microphone around, so if you have a question, please ask it into the microphone so those who are listening to this online in the future are able to hear the question and the answer. Okay, anyone have a question?
Obviously, the coca leaf and cocaine help with altitude sickness.
Oh, absolutely.
Has there been any research done as to how that happens and how it might be?
Well, they're conducting research in Peru. I don't know, but
There must be some mechanism that
well, I
does
think
that.
part of it is the stimulant.
Just the stimulation.
Yeah. And I don't know, but if you like over drink coffee, it can actually have the opposite effect. It can make you nauseous. And that doesn't really happen with coca. So, and I think it's sort of this stimulant that it's at a low level but a constant level, especially when they chew the leaves. But as far as the mechanism, I don't know. Not being a physiologist.
We would have an obvious use for treating mountain sickness.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm sure. I was there at one time where, we were there as a group, and there was this one fellow, he had heart problems. I thought, God, he shouldn't be here. I mean, we're up at 10,000 feet constantly. And I think having a constant coca tea saved his life. So.
Is the coca leaf legal in the United States or any other country?
No, that's why I don't have any. If I had some, if I had some tea, I would have brought, I brought quinoa and chocolate and all that, but, but no. So, I mean, it may change, just like now, cannabis is more available, it's more possible, and now they're reducing, even though it's still a controlled substance, they're not prosecuting it so much, and which has allowed people to figure out what good things it can really do. And I've actually seen extractions from the cannabis plant actually help people with certain ailments. So.
If there aren't any more questions, I think we'll wrap it up for today.
Well,
So
thank you very
once
much
again.
for coming. And do look at the books and enjoy them, and with the refreshments as well.